All right, so 50 days into Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and it looks like Vladimir Putin's not only losing battles, he's also losing the bigger geopolitical war. Earlier this week, the prime ministers of Finland and Sweden took a major step forward towards joining the NATO alliance.
The European security architecture have changed fundamentally after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We need to assess how our possible NATO membership would respond to our security needs. We also need to be very frank about consequences and risks.
We have to really think through what is best for Sweden and our security and our peace in this new situation.
So if Finland and Sweden actually join NATO, it would be a big deal. Finland, which gained its independence from the Russian Empire in 1917, still shares an 800-mile border with the former imperial power. If NATO membership extends to Finland, the military alliance would nearly double its land border with Russia. Keep in mind, both Finland and Sweden have been officially neutral for decades. Both countries have been NATO partners since 1995, when they abandoned that historic neutrality and joined the EU after the end of the Cold War. So becoming full NATO members now would actually be a huge win for the bloc. But as the Finnish prime minister said, there are consequences and there are risks. In response to their announcement, former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev, a close ally of Putin and the head of Russia's Security Council, issued a warning. Medvedev threatened that Russia would deploy nuclear weapons and hypersonic missiles in the Baltics if Finland and Sweden join NATO. Quote, "There can be no more talk of any nuclear-free status for the Baltic. The balance must be restored," he said. Now, in response to Russia, Finland's Europe minister told Sky News on Friday that it was highly likely they'd join NATO despite Moscow's threats, but that a decision still hadn't been made. Now, if part of Putin's strategy in illegally invading Ukraine was to somehow scare European countries out of wanting to join NATO, well, that plan has totally backfired, and it isn't the only blow for Moscow this week. A key Russian warship stationed in the Black Sea with a crew of 500 sank on Thursday after an explosion and fire on board. Ukraine says that it was behind the attack, and the Pentagon confirmed on Friday that 2 Ukrainian missiles actually caused the ship to sink. Remember, Ukraine spent years trying to get what Finland and Sweden seem to be vying for now: NATO membership to protect itself in a case of Russian incursions. So if Finland and Sweden look like they might get the green light now, why didn't Ukraine? Joining me now to discuss this and much more is Ivo Daalder, former U.S. ambassador to NATO during the Obama administration. He's currently the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Ambassador, it's great to see you again. Thank you so much for coming back on the show. We'll start with that big news coming out of Finland and Sweden. They are now discussing membership to NATO. They certainly expressed there is an interest for it. They obviously have to decide to formally apply, and they would only become members by a unanimous vote from the alliance itself. But if they were to join NATO, put this in context for us. How big of a deal would this be? Because on one hand, Latvia and Estonia are already NATO members. They also share a border with Russia, but Russia doesn't seem to care so much about them being members of NATO. How would this be different?
Well, the most important thing is it would bring in 2 very, very capable militaries into NATO. These are countries, Sweden and Finland, that during the Cold War and after the Cold War have maintained very strong militaries as neutral states, not on the basis that they would assume that Russia or the Soviet Union would not do it harm, but in fact by being capable of defending themselves. For the past 30 years, they have been very close partners with NATO. They have operated in NATO operations in Afghanistan, in the Balkans, over Libya, in a whole variety of ways. And now you bring in 2 major, in fact, the last major European powers into the NATO alliance. Yes, they are bordering, in the case of Finland, Russia, but they are also bringing even more military capability to the defense of all NATO territory. That's not what Vladimir Putin was counting on when he invaded Ukraine, but it is a direct result of that decision.
Finland, like Ukraine, used to be a part of Russia, as we mentioned. It also shares a large land border with Russia. So if you're Ukraine right now, if you're President Zelensky and you're looking at this news, you must be wondering why NATO is somehow open to accepting these 2 NATO members, especially Finland, but wouldn't accept Ukraine a few years ago when they've been seeking the same exact NATO membership for years. What would you say if you were asked to address the Ukrainians and explain to them why NATO would accept Finland and Sweden but would not have accepted Ukraine several years ago?
Well, I would say, first of all, you were right to try to join NATO, because had you joined NATO, I'm pretty sure that the war that is currently happening on Ukrainian territory would not have taken place. The whole reason why NATO offers protection is because it is a credible protection. And the failure for NATO to do so with regard to Ukraine, indeed, the constant reminder that NATO will defend every inch of NATO territory, but not territory that is currently being attacked, is undermining the deterrence capability and security in the West. So, first of all, the Ukrainians were right to want to be part of NATO. It would have made a difference, and I think NATO now regrets not having brought them in. That said, no war has started with regard to Finland or indeed Sweden, and so in order to prevent one from happening, Helsinki and Stockholm have now are very close to making a decision to apply for membership, and I'm very confident that the 30 NATO members would in fact say yes to that request and invite them to join, maybe as soon as in the next few months.
And of course, as expected, though, Russia's responded to Finland and Sweden by saying that it might deploy nuclear weapons and hypersonic missiles in Kaliningrad, which is wedged between Poland and Lithuania. Are you at all worried about any fallback from Finland and Sweden's NATO ambitions, especially after these recent threats? Because in an interview out today with CNN's Jake Tapper, President Zelensky said that he believed Putin could use nuclear weapons if he wanted to, and that all countries are actually worried. Do you share that assessment?
Well, first of all, there are believed to be already nuclear weapons in Kaliningrad. At least that's what the Lithuanian foreign minister said today. So in that sense, putting more nuclear weapons there or revealing that they are in fact there, wouldn't it be nothing new? But we do have to be worried about nuclear weapons. We haven't had a nuclear weapon used in war since 1945. That's a very long record, despite wars of all kinds over the almost 80 years since. And as the CIA director, Bill Burns, said yesterday, Putin is the kind of guy who, feeling cornered, might well feel the pressure and the need to use a tactical or low-yield nuclear weapon. Any use of nuclear weapons, no matter how small, no matter how low yield, will be a fundamental strategic change in global politics, and I think would require the United States and NATO to respond with very significant military consequences, including, in my view, coming to the aid of Ukraine and making sure that Ukraine can actually win the war against Russia.
All right, we'll wait and see what happens with Finland and Sweden this summer. Ambassador Ivo Daalder, sir, thank you so much. Great to see you as always. Appreciate your insights.